Never sign a marriage contract you don't understand, my father used to say, but that advice arrived about 3 days too late for me. Somewhere on the far edge of civilized space where my cargo ship drifted in orbit around a dusty trading station and the warning lights on my console blinked like tired red eyes reminding me I had exactly 72 hours before the Port Authority repossessed the only thing I owned in the galaxy. The Iron Wren wasn't much to look at, a patched-up freighter. Barely 140 feet long with engines that rattled like loose bolts in a toolbox. But she was mine, and losing her would mean losing the only life I knew. So when the station clerk slid a thin holographic tablet across the counter and said there was a government incentive program offering debt relief in exchange for a temporary diplomatic marriage arrangement, I didn't laugh, I didn't ask questions, and I definitely didn't read the fine print. I just signed my name, Ethan Carter, with a hand that smelled faintly like engine coolant and stale station coffee. 10 minutes later the clerk told me my bride would be arriving shortly, which was the moment I realized I might have made a mistake, because marriage programs weren't exactly common out here past the frontier lanes where freighters hauled ice, minerals, and sometimes questionable cargo between lonely systems. The docking bay outside my ship hummed with the low vibration of station gravity generators and the sharp, metallic scent of recycled air, while cargo drones rolled past carrying crates the size of pickup trucks, and I stood there wiping grease from my hands onto my jacket, trying to imagine what kind of alien civilization would send one of their citizens to marry a broke human pilot with overdue maintenance bills. The answer arrived 30 seconds later when the bay doors parted with a hydraulic sigh and a tall figure stepped through the soft white mist of the pressure seal, and every sound in the hangar seemed to quiet for a heartbeat. She was taller than me by almost a foot, maybe 6'8" if I had to guess. Her skin a smooth shade of blue-violet that caught the overhead lights like polished glass, and the way she moved was calm and controlled, not like someone meeting a stranger for the first time but like someone entering a room they already owned. Long silver dark hair rested across her shoulders, and her eyes, bright, reflective, almost metallic, studied the rusted hull of my freighter, the oil stains on the deck, and finally me, as if she were evaluating a very strange piece of equipment she hadn't expected to find here. For a moment neither of us spoke. The distant hum of a shuttle engine echoing somewhere across the bay while a digital display above my ship blinked my docking fee countdown in large red numbers. And then she stepped closer with quiet, precise footsteps that sounded far too confident for someone about to marry a man she had never met. "You are Ethan Carter," she said, her voice smooth and steady, carrying a faint musical tone that my translator struggled to flatten into English. I nodded slowly, suddenly aware that my jacket was stained, my ship was falling apart, and I had absolutely no idea who I had just agreed to marry. "That's me," I said, forcing a crooked smile while the warning light above the docking meter ticked down another minute of debt. She studied my face for a long second, and something curious flickered behind those bright alien eyes before she gave a small nod. "Then our arrangement begins now," she said. I glanced past her toward the empty docking corridor, and then back at the calm, mysterious woman standing in front of my beat-up freighter, and a strange thought crept into my mind that I couldn't quite explain yet, because people who signed temporary marriage contracts usually looked nervous, awkward, maybe embarrassed, but this woman looked like someone who had just stepped onto a throne. The first thing I noticed after she said that was the silence in the docking bay. Not the kind of silence that comes from emptiness, but the kind that happens when every machine, every drone, and every worker nearby suddenly slows down just a little because something unusual has entered the room. And standing there in front of my rusted freighter, I had the strange feeling that the entire station had noticed her arrival before I even understood what was happening myself. Lyra, that was the name. She gave me a moment later when I finally remembered basic human manners and introduced myself properly. And the way she said it sounded less like an introduction and more like a simple fact of the universe, as if that name had existed long before I had ever signed that contract. Up close I could see faint patterns in her blue-violet skin, subtle lines that caught the overhead lights of the hangar and shimmered like distant starlight across water, and I suddenly became very aware that my ship smelled faintly like hot wiring insulation and recycled air filters that should have been replaced 6 months ago. She studied the Iron Wren carefully, her gaze moving across the dented cargo ramp, the scratched hull plates, the engine vents that whined slightly every time the internal cooling fan spun up, and for a moment I expected her to laugh, or at least look disappointed. Instead, she simply asked, very calmly, "This vessel is yours?" I nodded and rested a hand against the hull beside me, feeling the familiar warmth of the metal beneath my palm. 142 feet from nose to engine ring, I said, a little defensively. She is not pretty, but she still crosses 3 systems on half a tank and stubborn optimism. And to my surprise, something almost like curiosity flickered across her expression. She stepped closer to the ship and placed one hand gently against the metal plating, as if she were listening to the quiet vibration of the engines through the hull. For a few seconds she said nothing, and the docking timer above the bay continued counting down my unpaid port fees in glowing red numbers that felt louder every time they changed. Finally, she turned back toward me and tilted her head slightly. "You rely on this vessel for survival," she said, not as a question, but as a quiet observation. "Yes," I answered. "And if the station repossesses her in 2 days, I will be relying on my ability to sweep floors instead," which earned a brief pause from her, as if humor was a concept she understood but had not expected to encounter here. Somewhere above us, a cargo shuttle lifted away from the station with a deep vibrating hum that rolled through the hangar floor, and Lyra watched it disappear through the force field of the launch gate before returning her attention to me. "Your situation required a rapid solution," she said slowly. "That is one way to describe it," I replied. I gestured toward the open cargo ramp of my ship, suddenly realizing we were still standing in the middle of the docking bay, while several station workers pretended not to stare at us. "Well, temporary spouse," I said with a small shrug. "Welcome aboard the Iron Wren." And for the first time since she arrived, she hesitated for a fraction of a second before walking up the ramp into the dim cargo hold of my ship. The interior lights flickered on automatically, illuminating rows of worn equipment lockers, a narrow staircase leading up to the cockpit, and the faint smell of engine oil that every pilot eventually stops noticing. Lyra looked around slowly, her bright eyes taking in every corner of the ship as if memorizing it piece by piece. And then she said something that made the back of my mind tighten with quiet confusion. "This vessel is inefficient," she said thoughtfully, "yet it has endured." And she glanced back at me with that same calm, analytical gaze. "You and this ship appear to share the same quality." The cargo hold lights hummed softly above us as the Iron Wren settled into its familiar rhythm, a quiet vibration running through the floor plates that every pilot eventually learns to read like a heartbeat. And Lyra stood in the center of it all with that same calm stillness, as if the ship were not a cramped freighter, but a chamber designed for her arrival. I climbed the short ladder toward the cockpit and gestured for her to follow, half expecting her to hesitate in the narrow corridor that forced most people to duck under exposed pipes and wiring panels. But she moved through the ship with slow, deliberate steps, carefully observing everything from the scratched control panels to the faded Earth decals someone had stuck near the life support monitor years ago. When she entered the cockpit, she paused beside the co-pilot seat and studied the forward window where the stars stretched out beyond the station's transparent docking shield. Thousands of distant lights scattered across a black sky that always made the rest of the universe feel impossibly large. I dropped into the pilot chair and tapped the console to wake the systems, and the displays flickered to life one by one, projecting soft blue light across the small cabin while the engine diagnostics scrolled through their usual list of complaints. Lyra remained standing behind the co-pilot's seat, watching the data screens with an intensity that reminded me of a flight instructor evaluating a trainee. "You understand these systems," she said after a moment. I shrugged and rested my boots lightly against the lower panel. "I understand them well enough to keep them from falling apart in the middle of nowhere," I replied. She leaned slightly closer to the main display where a 3-dimensional map of nearby systems rotated slowly above the console. "You travel alone through these regions," she said, and again it sounded less like a question and more like a quiet observation. "Most of the time," I answered, adjusting a power relay that had been blinking amber since the last refuel stop. "Out here you either learn to rely on yourself or you learn how to get stranded very quickly." She considered that answer in silence while the Iron Wren's sensors registered another freighter departing the station several hundred yards away, its engines leaving a faint ripple of blue light across the docking shield. After a few seconds, Lyra reached forward and lightly touched the edge of the navigation display, her finger hovering just above the rotating star map without actually contacting the surface. "Your navigation grid is inefficient," she said calmly. "There are shorter routes between these systems." I blinked and turned halfway in my chair to look at her. "If you know better trade routes than the entire frontier shipping network, then you should probably talk to the Guild," I said with a faint grin. She did not smile, but her eyes followed the shifting map carefully, tracing several paths through the stars that did not appear on any of the standard lanes. "Your species prefers established routes," she said softly. "But there are other ways to cross distance." Something in the way she said it made the small cockpit feel even quieter than before. And for the first time I noticed that Lyra did not look at the stars the way most travelers did, with wonder or curiosity, but with the calm familiarity of someone studying territory they already knew. I leaned back slightly in my chair and folded my arms. "You talk about the galaxy like you have seen a lot more of it than most people," I said. Lyra's gaze remained fixed on the distant stars beyond the cockpit window, and after a moment she answered in the same steady tone she had used since the moment we met. "I have." For a long moment, I simply watched her standing there beside the navigation console, the faint glow of the star map reflecting in those strange metallic eyes, while the iron Wren's engines idled beneath our feet, like a patient animal waiting to be told where to go next. And something about the way Lyra looked at the galaxy outside the cockpit window made the hair on the back of my neck prickle with quiet curiosity. Most travelers who stepped onto a frontier freighter reacted the same way when they saw open space through a cockpit canopy. They leaned forward. They stared. They pointed out constellations, or shipping lanes, or distant nebula clouds glowing purple and gold across the dark. But Lyra did none of those things. She studied the stars the way a cartographer studies a map that already belongs to them. I cleared my throat and tapped the docking clearance panel, partly to break the silence, and partly because the station timer above our berth was still counting down the hours, until they started asking uncomfortable questions about unpaid fees. "Well," I said, letting the control yoke shift gently beneath my hands, "if our arrangement officially begins now, we should probably get off this station before someone decides to double-check the paperwork." Lyra turned slightly from the window and regarded the console with calm focus, while the systems flickered through their startup cycle. The Iron Wren was not a sophisticated ship by any reasonable standard. The autopilot needed encouragement. The navigation computer lagged whenever it calculated more than 3 jumps ahead, and the environmental control unit hummed like a refrigerator that had seen better decades. But every bolt and wire in the vessel had been kept alive through stubborn patience and careful hands. I began flipping switches along the ignition row, bringing the thrusters online one by one until the deck vibrated with a steady mechanical rhythm. Lyra watched every motion carefully. "You maintain this vessel yourself," she said quietly. I nodded without looking up from the panel. "Every system on this ship has tried to stop working at least once," I replied, "and I convinced most of them to keep going." A faint pause followed as the docking clamps released with a heavy metallic click that echoed through the hull. Outside the forward canopy, the station's circular hangar slowly rotated into view as the ship lifted gently from the berth. Cargo haulers the size of small office buildings drifted through distant lanes, while maintenance drones buzzed around the station structure like metallic insects tending a hive. Lyra stepped slightly closer to the pilot chair and watched the maneuver thrusters adjust our angle by a few careful degrees. "You do not rely on automated navigation," she observed. I chuckled softly. "Automation is great until it decides you are a collision hazard," I said, guiding the ship toward the open launch corridor that shimmered with a faint blue barrier separating atmosphere from vacuum. Lyra studied the glowing exit ahead, and then glanced briefly toward the navigation map again. "The route you will choose," she said slowly, "will not be the most efficient one." I raised an eyebrow and glanced back at her. "You sound very confident about that for someone who has been on my ship for less than 10 minutes, I said. For the first time since I met her, something almost like amusement flickered across her expression. She looked back out at the stars beyond the station's launch gate and spoke in the same calm voice she had used from the beginning. "Efficiency," she said softly, "depends on how much of the galaxy you have already seen." The moment the iron ren cleared the launch corridor, the stars seemed to expand across the cockpit canopy, like someone had suddenly removed a ceiling from the universe, and the station behind us shrank into a ring of distant lights, while the navigation console quietly plotted our first jump vector through a field of pale blue markers that represented the safest shipping lanes across this sector. I eased the throttle forward and felt the ship respond with its familiar low vibration, the engines humming with a tone that only long hours in the pilot's seat could teach someone to trust. Beside me, Lyra remained standing in calm silence, her gaze fixed on the wide field of stars stretching far beyond the limits of the station's orbit. Most passengers reacted to their first departure with excitement or at least curiosity, but Lyra simply observed everything with the steady patience of someone watching a process unfold exactly as expected. The iron ren rolled gently onto its outbound heading, while the auto-guidance system blinked for confirmation, and I reached over to disable the automatic route calculation before it could finish. A small amber warning appeared on the screen informing me that a manual course might not represent the most efficient travel path. I tapped the acknowledgement button and continued adjusting the coordinates anyway. Behind me, Lyra spoke in that same even voice that never seemed hurried or surprised. "You are ignoring the recommended route." I glanced over my shoulder with a faint grin and shrugged. Recommended routes are usually recommended by people who never had to pay fuel costs, I replied, entering a slightly longer path that avoided the crowded freight corridors where station authorities like to inspect small, independent ships like mine. Lyra stepped closer to the console and studied the new course line that curved across the star map. "This path adds distance," she said. I nodded. "Distance is cheaper than attention," I explained, nudging the ship another degree toward open space while the forward thrusters pushed us farther from the station's gravity well. For a moment she said nothing, her eyes following the glowing path on the display as the iron ren gained speed. Then she looked back at the stars beyond the canopy. "You adapt your decisions constantly," she said quietly. "Out here you either adapt or you drift until someone else decides what to do with you," I replied. The engines reached their steady cruising output, and the navigation system signaled that the jump drive would be ready in approximately 40 seconds. The cockpit lights dimmed slightly as power shifted through the ship's aging systems. Lyra rested one hand lightly against the edge of the co-pilot console and continued watching the swirling star field ahead. After a moment she spoke again, almost thoughtfully. "Your species values independence strongly." I chuckled softly and leaned back in the pilot chair. "That is one way to put it," I said. "Most humans simply do not like being told where they belong." Lyra's eyes reflected the faint glow of distant nebula clouds while she considered that answer. The jump countdown on the console reached 15 seconds, and a quiet tone echoed through the cockpit. I wrapped my hand around the control yoke and prepared to initiate the drive. Just before the countdown reached 0, Lyra spoke again, her voice calm, but carrying a note of certainty that made me glance toward her for the briefest moment. "Ethan Carter," she said, "if you are willing to adjust your course slightly, you could arrive at your destination nearly 6 hours sooner." I raised an eyebrow. "And how would you know that?" I asked. Lyra looked directly at the navigation display, then back toward the endless field of stars outside the canopy, and answered with the same quiet confidence she had shown since the moment she stepped onto my ship. "Because that route," she said softly, "was mapped long before your shipping lanes existed." For a few seconds I did not say anything, because there are certain statements a person hears that immediately trigger two competing reactions inside the human brain: curiosity and skepticism, and Lyra had just delivered one of those statements with the same calm confidence she used for everything else. The jump countdown on the console continued quietly. 10 seconds, 9 seconds. While the starfield outside the cockpit stretched into faint lines as the iron ren's drive prepared to bend space around the ship, I glanced from the navigation screen to Lyra and back again. "Mapped long before our shipping lanes existed," I repeated slowly, resting my hand on the control yoke. "That would make it a very old map." Lyra did not look at me immediately, her gaze still fixed on the rotating star chart projected above the console. The holographic grid reflected across her blue-violet skin in thin bands of light. "Yes," she said simply. The jump alarm chimed once and the drive engaged with a deep humming resonance that traveled through the deck plates. and the stars outside the canopy stretched into long ribbons of white light before folding away into the strange quiet tunnel of hyperspace. The cockpit lighting shifted automatically to low amber as the iron wrench settled into cruise, and the familiar vibration of the jump engines filled the small cabin with a steady rhythmic pulse. I leaned back in the pilot chair and folded my arms loosely across my chest while the ship handled the first stage of the transit. "All right," I said after a moment, studying her carefully. "Most people I meet out here are miners, traders, or scientists who read too many navigation manuals. So you telling me you know older routes across this sector is a little unusual." Lyra finally turned her head slightly toward me. Her expression remained composed, but there was a thoughtful focus in her eyes, as if she were considering how much information to reveal. "Your maps are based on relatively recent exploration," she said. "Many systems were charted by earlier civilizations long before your species began traveling between stars." I tapped the navigation console and pulled up the projected route we were currently following. A curved line of light connected a chain of star systems that frontier pilots had used for decades. "If someone knew a better path," I said, "every shipping company in this quadrant would pay a fortune for it." Lyra watched the map quietly, then raised one slender hand and pointed toward a region of the display where empty space separated two distant stars by several light years. "There," she said softly. I followed the direction of her finger. According to the computer, there was nothing between those systems but dark interstellar distance. "That is a very expensive shortcut," I replied with a faint smile. "My navigation system says there is absolutely nothing there." Lyra did not argue. Instead, she looked back toward the canopy where the swirling colors of hyperspace drifted slowly past the glass like rivers of pale light. "Your system does not recognize it," she said calmly, "because the passage was never shared with your navigational networks." I tilted my head slightly. "And you just happen to know it," I said. For a moment she remained silent again, and the steady hum of the jump drive filled the cockpit. Then she answered in the same measured voice she had used since the beginning. "Ethan Carter," she said quietly, "there are places in the galaxy that exist between the routes your civilization believes are possible." She paused briefly and looked back toward the navigation display. "I have traveled through some of them." For a while the only sound in the cockpit was the steady resonance of the jump drive humming through the iron wren's aging hull, a low mechanical rhythm that every long-haul pilot eventually learns to treat like background music, but my mind was not focused on the engines anymore. It was focused on the woman standing beside the navigation console, who spoke about hidden routes through the galaxy the way a rancher might talk about shortcuts across familiar land. I leaned forward slightly and pulled the star map closer, expanding the section she had pointed at earlier until the projection filled half the cockpit with pale blue light. According to every database available to frontier pilots, that region of space was empty. No stations, no colonies, no jump beacons, just several light years of dark vacuum between two distant systems. "Let me get this straight," I said slowly while the holographic grid rotated above the console. "You are telling me there is a route through here that the navigation networks do not know about?" Lyra stood calmly with one hand resting lightly on the back of the co-pilot's seat, her gaze moving across the display with quiet concentration. "Yes," she answered. I shook my head with a faint laugh that carried more curiosity than disbelief. "If that is true, then either you are the most well-informed traveler I have ever met, or the entire Interstellar Navigation Guild has missed something very important." Lyra considered that for a moment, and then said in the same steady tone she used for everything else, "Both of those possibilities could be accurate." I leaned back in the chair and studied her more carefully. Most passengers shifted around nervously during hyperspace travel, but Lyra stood as still as a statue, completely comfortable in the low amber lighting of the cockpit, while the distant currents of warped starlight drifted beyond the canopy. "You speak about the galaxy like someone who has seen a lot more of it than the average explorer," I said. Lyra looked toward the canopy again, watching the shifting colors of hyperspace as if she were reading something written in the currents themselves. "Your civilization has only recently expanded beyond a few hundred systems," she replied. "To you the galaxy still appears vast and mysterious." I raised an eyebrow. "And to you it does not." She was quiet for a few seconds before answering. "It is still vast," she said softly. but not as unfamiliar. The way she said it carried a calm certainty that made the cockpit feel a little smaller for a moment. I turned back to the navigation console and tapped the map again, marking the coordinates she had indicated earlier. The computer immediately flagged the path as unstable due to the absence of known jump markers. According to this, I said, trying that shortcut would leave us navigating blind between systems for several hours. Lyra stepped closer and studied the warning indicator without concern. Not blind, she said, quietly. Only unassisted. I glanced at her again. You seem very confident about that for someone who has been on my ship for less than a day. Lyra's expression remained composed, but there was a subtle brightness in her eyes now, something that suggested interest rather than caution. Confidence, she said slowly, comes from experience. The iron ring continued gliding through hyperspace while the navigation console projected the unknown coordinates in pale blue light, and after a moment I found myself staring at the unfamiliar route with a growing sense of curiosity. Most pilots avoided the unknown because the unknown could cost them their ship, their cargo, or months of travel time. But there was something strangely convincing about the way Lyra spoke, as if the path she described was not a theory but a memory. I rested my hand on the console and looked back at her. Tell me something, I said. How exactly did you learn about routes that the rest of the frontier has never even recorded? Lyra met my gaze calmly and answered with the same quiet confidence that had followed her since the moment she stepped onto the iron ring. Because, she said softly, those routes were not meant to be public. The hum of the jump drive continued to roll through the iron ring like distant thunder trapped inside metal walls, steady and predictable. But the quiet certainty in Lyra's last words had left my thoughts anything but steady. Routes not meant to be public was the kind of phrase that sounded impressive in stories told by explorers at frontier bars. But out here in the real shipping lanes, information like that usually came from governments, military archives, or civilizations far older than the one that built my ship. I leaned forward and expanded the star map again, letting the projection fill the cockpit with soft blue light while the ship glided through hyperspace currents outside the canopy. The coordinates she had indicated still blinked quietly on the display, like a suggestion waiting for a decision. Not meant to be public, I repeated slowly, glancing back at her. That sounds like the kind of map someone keeps locked in a vault. Lyra remained calm beside the console, her posture relaxed yet perfectly balanced, as if the subtle vibration of the ship did not affect her at all. She looked down at the projection for a moment before answering. Some knowledge is shared slowly, she said, especially when civilizations are still learning how to use it. I let out a quiet breath through my nose and leaned back in the pilot chair. You say things like that as if humanity just arrived yesterday, I said. Lyra did not argue with that. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the swirling hyperspace currents beyond the cockpit glass where faint ribbons of blue and violet light flowed past like distant rivers. In cosmic terms, she said gently, your species did. I could not help smiling a little at that. You are very confident for someone who agreed to marry a struggling cargo pilot, I replied. For the first time since we had left the station, Lyra's expression softened just enough to hint at something close to amusement. She looked back at the navigation display and extended one hand again, this time adjusting the holographic map slightly until the hidden coordinates aligned between two systems that were normally separated by a long arc of travel. The projected distance shortened by several light years if the path actually existed. Your current course will take 18 hours to reach the next refueling station, she said quietly. If you adjust here, she traced a line between the two stars. The journey would take less than 12. I stared at the display for several seconds. Saving 6 hours of travel time might not sound dramatic to someone living on a planet, but out here, every hour of engine burn meant fuel, maintenance, and docking fees. You realize that if this shortcut does not exist, I said slowly, we would drift through empty space for a very long time before finding the next safe jump point. Lyra looked at me directly now, her bright metallic eyes reflecting the pale light of the star map. It exists, she said simply. Something in the way she spoke made the cockpit feel very quiet again. The way a room feels when someone states a fact that leaves no room for argument. I studied her for a moment, then glanced back at the blinking coordinates. Every instinct I had learned from years of frontier flying told me to trust the official lanes, but another quieter instinct was starting to whisper something else. I reached forward and hovered my hand above the navigation controls. "All right," I said slowly, still watching the unfamiliar path glowing across the map. "Suppose I believe you for a moment." Lyra tilted her head slightly. "Yes?" I looked back at her with a thoughtful half-smile. "Then the real question becomes how someone like you knows routes that entire exploration fleets somehow never recorded." I stared at the distortion ahead of the ship for several long seconds without touching the controls, because after years of flying cargo through ordinary shipping lanes, a pilot learns to recognize empty space very well, and what I was seeing ahead of the Iron Ren was definitely not empty space. The stars behind the ripple bent slightly, as if the universe itself had folded a thin, invisible corridor through the darkness, a subtle shift in light that would have been easy to miss if you were not looking directly at it. The navigation console continued to chirp quietly as it tried to interpret the sensor readings, but the computer could not classify what it was seeing and simply labeled the anomaly as an unknown gravitational distortion. I slowly leaned forward in the pilot chair and adjusted the sensor gain, watching the readings climb across the display while the ship drifted toward the faint corridor. "That should not be there," I said quietly, more to myself than to Lyra, beside me. She remained calm, her gaze fixed on the bending starlight ahead with the same steady certainty she had shown since the moment she pointed us in this direction. "It has always been there," she replied softly. I glanced at her and then back at the canopy. The distortion extended for what looked like several million miles, a narrow passage where the stars seemed stretched and shifted as if space itself had been gently pulled aside. The computer attempted to map it again and failed, the navigation display flashing a small warning icon about unstable spatial geometry. I let out a slow breath and rested both hands on the control yoke. "All right," I said. "Either we just discovered something every exploration fleet somehow overlooked, or you knew exactly where this corridor was hiding." Lyra did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped slightly closer to the cockpit window and studied the passage with quiet focus. After a moment, she said, "Maintain your current velocity and align the ship with the center of the distortion." I followed her instruction carefully, adjusting the ship's heading by a few degrees until the Iron Ren pointed directly toward the shimmering corridor. The sensors flickered again as the ship approached the edge of the anomaly, registering a narrow band of stable gravitational alignment within the distortion. The computer displayed a faint green pathway through the ripple, as if the ship's instruments had finally recognized a navigable structure hidden inside the phenomenon. I could not help smiling a little as the readings stabilized. "You know," I said. "If someone had told me this route existed yesterday, I would have assumed they were exaggerating after too much station coffee." Lyra glanced at the console briefly before returning her attention to the corridor ahead. "Many discoveries sound impossible until they are observed," she said calmly. The Iron Ren drifted closer to the entrance of the passage, and the stars along the edges of the corridor warped more dramatically now, forming a faint tunnel of distorted light that stretched across the void between the two systems. I adjusted the throttle slightly and felt the ship respond with a gentle push forward. The navigation console updated the projected travel time automatically, and the number on the screen dropped by nearly 6 hours exactly as Lyra had predicted. I let out a quiet whistle and shook my head in disbelief. "You were not guessing," I said. Lyra finally turned toward me again, her metallic eyes reflecting the strange, shimmering corridor ahead. "No," she replied simply. I studied her expression carefully, realizing that the calm confidence she carried was not curiosity or speculation. It was familiarity. I looked back toward the corridor of bending starlight stretching into the distance and slowly guided the Iron Ren forward toward its entrance. "Then I guess the next question," I said thoughtfully, "is how someone like you learned about passages through space that the rest of the galaxy never even noticed." The Iron Ren crossed the edge of the corridor slowly, and the moment the ship entered the distortion, the stars outside the canopy changed in a way I had never seen before. They did not stretch the way they did during a hyperspace jump, and they did not remain still like normal space either. Instead, they seemed to slide gently along the edges of the corridor, as if the universe had folded itself around a hidden road that only revealed its shape once you were already traveling through it. The navigation console reacted immediately, the sensors flooding the display with readings that the computer struggled to categorize while a narrow green line appeared across the star map, marking a stable path inside the anomaly. I kept both hands steady on the control yoke while the iron wren glided deeper into the corridor, the hull vibrating softly as the ship's systems adjusted to the unusual gravitational alignment surrounding us. The computer still thinks. This region is empty space, I said quietly while watching the sensor data scroll across the display. Lyra stood beside the cockpit window with the calm posture of someone observing a familiar landscape rather than a hidden phenomenon in the middle of interstellar distance. Your computer cannot recognize structures that were never included in its reference systems, she replied. I shook my head slowly, still watching the navigation screen where the projected travel time continued to shrink as the system recalculated our path. The number dropped again until the total journey time matched almost exactly the 12-hour estimate Lyra had given earlier. I could not help letting out a quiet breath of disbelief. You were not exaggerating, I said. Lyra turned slightly toward the console and studied the projection with quiet focus. This corridor has existed for a very long time, she said. Outside the canopy, the corridor extended forward like a faint tunnel of distorted starlight, stretching between the two distant systems, and the iron wren moved through it smoothly as if it had always belonged there. The sensors continued to struggle with the anomaly, occasionally flashing warning icons that quickly disappeared once the ship stabilized within the corridor's gravitational alignment. I adjusted the throttle slightly and felt the engines respond with a soft, steady push. The ship accelerated without resistance, as if the corridor itself was guiding the vessel forward. I leaned back a little in the pilot chair and glanced toward Lyra again, trying to understand how someone who had stepped onto my ship less than a day ago could navigate through something like this with absolute confidence. You said earlier that some knowledge is shared only within limited circles, I said slowly. Lyra nodded once. Yes. I looked back at the distorted tunnel ahead and then back at her. Then those circles must be very exclusive, I said. For a moment Lyra remained silent while the shifting currents of bent starlight reflected across her blue-violet skin. Finally, she spoke in that same steady voice she had used since the beginning of the journey. They are not exclusive, she said quietly. They are simply very old. The iron wren continued gliding deeper into the corridor, while the star map recalculated the projected arrival point again and again, each time confirming that the hidden passage was carrying us across the empty region far faster than any normal route could have managed. I rested one hand on the console and looked out through the canopy at the strange river of starlight stretching ahead. After several seconds I spoke again. Lyra, I said thoughtfully. People who know secrets like this usually have very interesting stories behind them. She turned her gaze toward me calmly. I studied her expression and then added with a small curious smile. And I have a feeling yours is going to be one of them. The corridor of distorted starlight stretched endlessly ahead of the iron wren like a quiet river flowing through the darkness between stars. And for the first time since I became a pilot, I found myself traveling through space that no shipping beacon had ever mapped, no freight captain had ever recorded, and no navigation guild had ever approved. The ship moved smoothly through the hidden passage as if the corridor itself had decided to guide us forward, the engines humming in a steady rhythm, while the navigation console continuously recalculated our position with growing confusion. The sensors still insisted we were crossing an empty region of space, yet the clock on the display continued to prove otherwise as the remaining travel time dropped lower and lower with every passing minute. I rested my hand lightly against the control panel and looked out through the canopy again, watching the strange bending of distant stars sliding past the hull of my old freighter. Beside me, Lyra stood quietly, her posture calm and balanced as if she had traveled this route many times before. The faint currents of distorted starlight reflected across her blue-violet skin, giving her the appearance of someone standing beneath a sky filled with moving constellations. I studied her for a moment before speaking again. You know, I said thoughtfully, most pilots spend years chasing rumors about hidden passages through the frontier, and today I accidentally married someone who apparently knows exactly where they are. Lyra turned slightly toward me, her metallic eyes reflecting the navigation lights from the console. For a moment she seemed to consider how to respond, and then she spoke in the same steady voice she had used since the beginning of the journey. "Some knowledge is inherited," she said quietly, "and some knowledge is simply remembered." I raised an eyebrow and leaned back in the pilot chair. "Remembered by who?" I asked. Lyra looked forward again at the corridor stretching into the distance. The iron wren continued gliding through the distortion with surprising ease, the ship's hull vibrating softly, as if the structure of space itself was gently pushing us along the hidden route. After a few seconds she answered, "By civilizations that have traveled these stars far longer than your records describe." The words hung quietly in the cockpit while the ship moved deeper into the corridor. I glanced down at the navigation console where the projected arrival time now showed we would reach the next system nearly 6 hours earlier than any official shipping lane could achieve. I shook my head slowly, half amused and half amazed. If the Navigation Guild ever finds out about this place, they will probably rewrite half their maps, I said. Lyra's expression softened slightly as she listened. "Perhaps one day they will," she replied. I looked back out at the strange flowing tunnel of light ahead and felt the quiet thrill that every explorer secretly hopes to feel at least once in their life. The feeling that you have stepped onto a path that almost no one else knows exists. After a moment I spoke again, my voice carrying a small hint of curiosity that had grown steadily stronger since Lyra first pointed us toward this passage. "There is still one thing I do not understand," I said. Lyra turned her gaze toward me calmly. I gave a small thoughtful smile and nodded toward the hidden corridor, stretching across the stars. "You knew exactly where this route was, exactly how to enter it, and exactly how long it would take to cross," I continued. "That kind of knowledge does not come from casual travel." Lyra remained silent for a few seconds while the faint light of the corridor reflected across her eyes. Then she answered with quiet certainty. "You are correct." I leaned forward slightly in the pilot chair. "So the real question is," I said slowly, "what kind of life teaches someone how to navigate secret roads through the galaxy before most pilots even know they exist?"